is Antonio Visani, who will be talking about the Western and Chinese conception of human rights, with African countries at the center of focus. Antonio is the Vice Chair of our Asian Student Research Committee at the International Association for Political Science Students. He's pursuing a Bachelor's in International Relations at the University of Pavia, where he's also a tutor of macroeconomics, and at the Ghislieri College, Italy's oldest college of excellence. He is also an Italian youth ambassador for the One Campaign, an international organization that fights against extreme poverty and preventable diseases in Sub-Saharan Africa. In his lecture, Antonio aims to illustrate the two conceptions of human rights, the Western and Chinese, and tries to answer the question, which conception do African countries support? He attempts to give an objective overview of the contentious topic of human rights in international relations, as well as an in-depth view of African countries' voting patterns in the United Nations Human Rights Council. Without much ado, I would like to invite Antonio to join us and begin his presentation. And as a small note, I'd like to add that you may write to us any questions you have during the lecture in the chat box. And Antonio, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Alishwai. So I'll share my screen. Okay. So the Western and the Chinese conception of human rights are focused on Africa. Let's see. So the lecture will be structured in four parts. The first one will be, I'll talk about Asian values. Then I'll talk about the Western conception of human rights. So first, Asian conception, in particular Chinese conception, and then Western conception. The Western conception will be structured, articulated in two parts, maximalist view and minimalist one. Then I'll try to talk about a common set of universal human rights. So how to merge these two conceptions, the Asian, Southeast Asian, and the Western. And then I'll end my lecture focusing on Africa. Which conception do African countries support? So let's start with Asian values. In particular, when I talk about Asian values now in this lecture, I will mean East and Southeast Asian countries. So in particular, China, but not only China, for example, also Singapore. So the Asian conception, the Asian values are structured in four parts. They consist of four main values. The first one is cultural relativism. So they believe that rights are culturally specific and not universal. Here is a cite from the China's 1991 white paper. So owing to tremendous differences in historical background, social systems, cultural traditions, and economic development, countries differ in their understanding and practice of human rights. So they stress as Asia's difference and demand, for this reason, a special treatment of the human rights record by the international community. They are against a universal political liberalism, because all they say is based on the fact that they think that Western values and rights are the result of the Enlightenment, the US, and also the French Revolution. So since Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, didn't have the Enlightenment, nor the revolutions such as the US and French one, they shouldn't be imposed. Universal human rights shouldn't be imposed on them. Human rights that are created in the West. So the second pillar of the Asian values is community, that community takes precedence over individuals. They are against individualism. Individualism, they think that is destructive of Asia's social mechanism and cohesion. Because of individualism, they would see increasing rates of violent crime, family breakdowns, homelessness, and drug abuse. Okay. But the problem is that Western conception of human rights puts individualism at the base of these human rights. So there is an incompatibility with the primacy of the individual upon which the Western notion of human rights rests. Third pillar, social and economic rights take precedence over civil and political rights. I took this citation from the Chinese White Paper 1991, the same as before. So political and civil rights on this view do not make sense to poor and illiterate multitudes, such as such rights are not meaningful under destitute and unstable conditions. Then the last one, the fourth pillar, rights are a matter of national sovereignty. And maybe this is the most contentious one. Human rights are internal affairs, not to be interfered with by foreign states or multinational agencies. So the West's attempt to apply universal standards are maybe, as we are seeing, for example, for the Chinese national, new Chinese law on Hong Kong, West attempt to apply universal standard of human rights developing countries is seen as a disguised cultural imperialism and an attempt to obstruct their development. So up to now, I've explained the Asian conception, the Chinese conception of human rights. And as I said, we are seeing this conception applied, for example, related to the Hong Kong issue. Okay. So, is it possible for Asian countries, in light after we have seen what they think, is it possible for Asian countries to share with Western countries a common set of universal, really universal human rights? I'll answer this question later on. Before answering the question, I will explain the Western conception of human rights. Western conception of human rights, as I said before, is articulated in two parts, in two views, two traditions. So the maximalist outlook, this is the first one. So human rights are civil rights, political rights, social rights. So the maximalist outlook thinks that human rights consist of these three types of rights. For example, right to security of the person, freedom of association, freedom of speech, right to a fair trial, freedom of religion, freedom from discrimination, but also political rights, rights to democratic government. So this is, I think, very contentious. Human rights, they say, since human rights are rights for all human beings, the basis, the common feature, the basis of human rights, the common feature of all human beings is individual agency. This is what maximalist thinkers think. And what is individual agency? Individual agency is the ability of the individuals to form conceptions of the good and the capacity to pursue these conceptions. So human rights, since all human beings have this individual agency, this is a common feature of all individual beings, human rights should be based on this individual agency. And human rights should provide are the rights that provide a minimum provision of needed to exercise and protect human agency. Human rights are the rights that protect human agency. Without these human rights, so without civil rights, political rights, social rights, human agency could not exist. But as you may have thought, the maximalist outlook is incompatible with Asian values. There is too much importance of individualism on individualism. So there is no common ground for a set of universal human rights shared both by China, Asia, Southeast Asian countries, and West, if we think about only the maximalist view. But if we see the minimalist outlook, then it's much more interesting for us. The minimalist outlook thinks that human rights should protect bodily security. So no torture, no killings, no rapes. So much less than maximalist outlook. So the basis of this minimalist outlook is toleration and acknowledgement of ethical pluralism. This here I'm citing from Ignatieff. If human rights are to apply to all as basic demands on social and political arrangements, then it seems desirable that they be acceptable to all. If we want them to be acceptable to all, then in view of the wide range of religious, philosophical, ethical, political outlooks, the content cannot be very demanding as the maximalist outlook. In particular, there is one tradition, one school of minimalism that is justificatory minimalism. Maybe the main, the leader, the main thinker of this school is Jacques Maritain. Jacques Maritain is a mid-20th century thinker, and he took part in the discussion that led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, justificatory minimalism wants to reach a conception of human rights that is not connected to a particular ethical outlook. So, a conception of human rights that is not based on Western liberal individualism. Okay. And so, human rights should be an independent normative enterprise to present a reasonable goal and norms for all countries. Since they are not connected to a particular ethical outlook, they have a practical role that is a standard shared by all nations. They go across national boundaries, and so they are common standards of all political societies. So I think that justificatory minimalism can be the base on which we can build, just in theory, we can build a conception of human rights that could be shared both by Western countries and by Southeast Asian countries. So a common set of truly universal human rights. So this is like these two slides are the core of the lecture. So justificatory minimalism can provide a common ground for a set of truly human rights. This is taken from Joshua Cohen, Joshua Cohen's work. You'll see the bibliography at the end of this lecture, of these slides. So the base will be justificatory minimalism. So human rights intended as bodily security, no rapes, no killings, no torture, not maximalism. So we can reach a truly universal human rights that are also based on East Asian culture and traditions. So East Asian countries, we have seen it, say that okay, they have cultural relativism. So they say, okay, Western human rights are based on Western history. Well, okay, so we can provide a set of human rights that is also eradicated on East Asian culture. So we now have a look on East Asian tradition, and the basis of this is Confucianism. Confucianism is structured, okay, this is a very essential explanation. Structure on 3 pillars. Human beings are not free and equal individuals in this view for Confucianism, but are persons standing in relation to others. They are not all equals as the Western view sees, okay, but are in a relation. So father, son, husband, wife, rulers, ruled. Okay, the society is a structure of relations. The second pillar is ethic. There are responsibilities and duties associated with human relationship to ensure the proper ordering of those relations. So the relations of the first pillar have attached to those relations also duties and responsibilities. And so in order to okay, in order to in order to answer these duties, people should have these virtues, that is humanness, ren, wisdom, fidelity, loyalty, and also observance of rituals, li. Another thing is that in order to understand what are these duties, what are one's duties, people should learn, should study in order to understand what their duties are. The third pillar is the political conception. Political officials have a responsibility and duties too, because of their role of political officials. And their duties are to care for the common good of subject. This is a citation from the Analects. Make sure there is sufficient food to eat, sufficient arms for defense, and that the common people have confidence in their leader. So, thus, a set of human rights that take into account the East Asian culture would be, these human rights would be the condition for fulfilling the obligation associated with human relationship. Violating human rights will infirm the ability of people to fulfill the obligation that flow from their relationship. In a nutshell, if I don't have these human rights that are the set that justificatory minimalism proposes, so protecting bodily security, no rapes, no killings, okay. If I don't have these basic human rights, I cannot fulfill my obligations associated with my role. And the second thing is that in this view, human rights would be a consequence of the responsibility of rulers to care for the common good. So how can rulers fulfill their responsibility of caring for the good of members if they fail to provide the protection required by a minimum set of human rights? If rulers don't provide a minimum set of human rights, okay, they do not fulfill their obligation associated with the role of rulers. They have to take care for the common good. So the result, if we follow this view, the result would be an independently elaborated conception of human rights. Human rights that are not centered on liberal individualism, but is centered on the concept of people as embedded in social relations and subject to obligation associated with those relationships. So a concept, a set of universal human rights that is shared both by, that could be shared both by Western countries and by East Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries. Okay. So which conception of human rights do African countries support? We have seen, we have to step back to go back a little bit. We have seen the East Asian values, East Asian conception of human rights, the Western conception of human rights, and how these two conceptions can merge in order to form a truly universal set of human rights, thanks to justificatory minimalism, and thanks to Joshua Cohen. So which conception of human rights do African countries support? Well, Africa and China share a common past. Africa had, we all know, Africa had a colonial past. And China had a semi-colonial, semi-feudal era. These are Mao's words. So beginning from the First Opium War, 1839, 1842, and then a century of humiliation when the British Empire and other Western countries sought to use their military force to impose one-sided agreements on China, on the Qing dynasty. So as a result, Africa and China have the belief that national sovereignty is non-negotiable and that human rights is a matter of national sovereignty. So we have seen that the fourth pillar of the Asian values is the result of China's past. But also, Africa has a similar view on that matter. For Africa, in fact, the 1963 Charter establishing the Organization of African Unity, that now the Organization of African Unity is the African Union, AU, gives no explicit obligation on member states for the protection of human rights. Why? Because they had a preference for social, economic development, territorial integrity, and firm reliance on the principle of non-interference in internal affairs of member states. Second element is that African countries helped China join the UN in place of Taiwan in 1971. African countries voted in favor of China, okay, so the People's Republic of China, to join the UN General Assembly in place of Taiwan, 1971. So African countries, we could think that, and indeed do support the Chinese conception of human rights, even in the UNHRC, the United Nations Human Rights Council. For example, the last example is like a perfect example of this thing. Is that on the second, for the typo, 2nd of July of 2020, 53 countries, of which 26 African, were signatory of a statement supporting China's national security law in Hong Kong, and they opposed another statement that was supported by 27 countries, mainly from Europe, because the United States pulled away from the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2018. So 26 African countries supported China's national security law. And China's national security law, one of the bases of this law is that, human rights are a matter of national, is a national matter, is a matter of, it is an internal matter. Okay. However, Africa has a Western human rights system, a human rights system, a way of protecting human rights that is typical of Western countries. Let's start from the Africa Charter on Human Rights and People's Rights, Human and People's Rights, that was adopted by the Organization of African Unity's Assembly, as I said, now it's the African Union, in 1981. The human rights that are recognized in this charter are environmental rights, economic and social rights, people's rights, the people's rights to development, and elimination of discrimination, equality before the law, but also political rights. Political rights are the people's right to self-determination by freely choose their government. So a charter that is very similar, has the same rights that the maximalist Western view theorize. We have seen that maximalists in the Western theory of human rights think that human rights should be composed of political rights, rights to self-determination by freely choose their government, civil rights, economic and social rights. Civil rights, for example, I will see freedom of association, freedom of speech. Second thing is the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. The African Commission of Human and People's Rights is composed of 11 members elected by the African Union Assembly. So communication, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights issues communication that are complaints and recommendations to a state if the state violates the Human Rights Charter. Okay, and this is crucial because if a state, for example, violates the political rights of the people's right to self-determination by freely vote their government, well, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights can issue a recommendation and a communication against to this state. If the state doesn't comply with the Commission's recommendation, then the Commission itself can defer the case to the African Court on Human and People's Rights that was established, entered into force in 2004. That is composed as the African Commission of 11 judges elected by the EU Assembly, the IAU Assembly, sorry. I live in the EU, so, okay, sorry. And the African Court on Human and People's Rights can issue final and binding decisions that are binding for the state that violates the human rights of the Charter. Of course, this is valid only for states that have signed the Africa Charter on Human and People's Rights. But the states that have ratified the Africa Charter on Human and People's Rights are all African states. They all have ratified this charter, except Morocco, that pulled out of the AU in 1984. So we have seen that here, Africa and China share a common past. And so African countries tend to support the Chinese conception of human rights. But on the other hand, Africa has a Western human rights system. These elements, the Africa Charter on Human Rights, a Commission on Human and People's Rights, a Court on Human and People's Rights, are typical of a Western human rights system. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights, ECHR, established a system that is very similar to this one. So we have a balance between these, if we want to answer the question, what type of rights do African countries support? But there is also another element for African countries, is that national interest. Okay, African countries have an interest in supporting the Chinese conception of human rights, in particular in the UN Human Rights Council. Why? Because there is a price to pay for challenging China. For example, Australia and Canada. Australia has called for an independent investigation into the origin of the COVID-19 outbreak, and China, like, retaliated by halting some beef and barley trade. On the other hand, like, 2 Canadian nationals were arrested in response to Canada's decision to arrest Huawei's CEO's daughter, Meng Wanzhou. So why would African countries want to risk retaliations from China on an issue that is not central for their national interest? This is one element. And the second one is that many of the African countries are now trying to renegotiate debt payments to China because of a COVID-related decrease, very sharp decrease in their GDP. For example, this is the Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to, Sub-Saharan Africa's GDP is expected to decrease by over 2.1%, between 2.1 and 5.1% in 2020. Well, of course, Italy and many European countries, GDP will decrease by over 10% this year. Okay, but we have to take into account that Sub-Saharan Africa, this is the first recession over 25 years of Sub-Saharan Africa, and the starting levels of Sub-Saharan Africa's countries is much lower, of course, than European one. And China is the largest creditor in Sub-Saharan Africa. China's loans amount to 64 billion. The second largest creditor is the World Bank. Usually in developing countries, the World Bank is the first largest largest creditor, but in this case, Sub-Saharan Africa, uh, China is the first one, 64 billion versus World Bank 62 billion. Uh, so why should African countries, uh, why should they oppose the Chinese conception of human rights? They are, well, they are now trying to renegotiate these step payments. It's in their interest to support it. Just by the way, this renegotiation is is like a one event, okay, that is supported by endorsed by the World Bank and the G20. Okay, it's under the, sorry. So it's part of the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, DSSI. So we have on the one side that the African countries support China's conception of human rights because of their common history, colonial history, and because of their interest. On the other hand, we have a Western, Africa has a Western human rights system. So we have to balance these these two elements. And so, in conclusion, it is possible to have a single set of universal human rights shared by all countries, East Asian countries included. So, if we would answer to the question, is it possible for Asian countries to share with Western countries a common set of universal human rights? Yes. Yes, if we use justificatory minimalism, it is possible. But on the other hand, African countries have a hybrid conception of human rights, which consists of elements both of the Chinese and the Western conception of human rights. So, in a nutshell, in this lecture, what I wanted to tell you is that yes, African countries have an hybrid conception of human rights, but on the other hand, it is still possible. It is possible to go beyond the division of East Asian conception and Western conception of human rights. If we use a conception, if we use if we use a truly universal set of human rights that is shared both by Asian countries and by European ones, and that is based on European but also Asian countries' history and traditions. Okay, so this is the essential bibliography, very essential. But if you want to know more about this, I'll suggest that you read these articles. I had to shorten this lecture because I'm ill. Sorry, I got a fever. But yes, this is it. Maybe the most interesting one is the Joshua Cohen's one, Minimalism About Human Rights, the most we can hope for, Journal for Political Philosophy. It's really interesting. I think it's says how we could merge the Asian and the Western conception of human rights. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonio.
Okay, I stopped sharing.
Yeah. Thank you. And now we move on to the questions. The first question for you is that the general opinion tends to see the cooperation South-South as beneficial for the development of African nations, but the Asian-African relationship does not differ from the African exchanges with developed countries if one looks closely. For example, in trade, African-Asian exchanges follow the same pattern as the former, that is natural resources versus manufactured products. In education, African students in Asian countries are trained with advanced technology and taught a certain work ethic, which may differ from the standard in Africa. And some graduate students from Asian countries may face difficulties of reintegration in their home country. What can potentially be the solutions to improve the Asian African relationship to become more beneficial for Africa's development?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that the African-China relationship does differ from Western Africa relations. In particular, if we look at loans, EU loans come with strings attached. So if African country wants to have a loan from the EU, well, they have to um, start start reforms, and these reforms usually are democratic reforms, um, because well, the European Union is based on the values of democracy, um, well, state of democracy, of yeah, respect of law. Um, so while on the other hand, China's loans comes with no strings attached. So the relation Africa, China, and Africa Western countries, well, I think they do differ between one another. However, it is true that the trade between Africa and China, sorry, uh, that Africa exports natural resources to China, and China exports manufactured products to Africa. So I think that a potential solution to improve Africa-China relations, um, well, could be this. I think that sorry. I think that well, one of the major concerns for Africa is the so-called debt trap diplomacy from China, like the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. They had a 1990-year lease to China. They had to lease this port for 1990 years because they couldn't pay back their debts. Okay. So, and China is the largest creditor in Sub-Saharan Africa, 64 billion. In the past 2 decades, China, Beijing, so China, gave 152 billion dollars worth loans to African countries. 152. So that's a lot. But now China is canceling their interest-free loans. So I think that's a great path. They are canceling interest-free loans are more or less 5% of the total amount of loans. So it's not much, but it's a beginning. It's a sign of goodwill that China will not carry out a debt trap diplomacy. And this is a great step. So a solution is that China presents herself as a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And then a responsible stakeholder in the international system doesn't carry out a debt trap diplomacy. So like renegotiating debt, showing good faith, goodwill. I think this is a beginning. This is the way. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your answer. And I think we'll cut it short because you need to rest. And yeah.
No, we can have one more question.
Are you sure?
Yeah, yes, I'm sure. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, what would you advise the UN Secretary General to do to address these global trends?
Okay. So I think the question refers to the human rights issue. So I think that Southeast Asian countries now they really have the impression that the West is trying to impose its rights on them. Well, I think well, this is an objective view, so I'm not taking a side. I'm from a Western country, but anyway, I think that this is their view. And but in a way, I think that universal human rights should be really universal. So they should be shared by all. They should be shared by all countries. So I think that the Secretary General should push towards a really universal um, human rights set. So maybe towards a set of human rights that is based on a minimalist view. Now, there are charters, for example, the Universal Declaration, that like include a really huge set of human rights. Um, that's great for me. For example, political, civil, like social, economic rights. I think that's absolutely right, but they are not enforced by maybe the majority, maybe half of the countries. So if we really want all the countries to enforce these human rights, the universal human rights, we should have a minimal set of human rights that is based on justificatory minimalism. So no killings, no rapes, but they protect just bodily security. So maybe it's a step back, yes. A step back, yes, but with this set of human rights, everybody, all the countries would support, would respect them because they really think that they are important. Now we have like a very complex and very huge set of human rights with lots of human rights but are not enforced by. So we have like a trade-off, I think now, to have human rights that are several human rights but not enforced by several countries. On the other hand, a minimum, like a set of minimum human rights, basic human rights, but enforced by all countries. So we have a trade-off, and I think we should take the path that leads to a minimum set of human rights.
All right, thank you. And brings us to the end of this session. Thank you again, Antonio, and a big thank you to everyone for joining us today. I hope the lecture was fruitful for everybody, and we hope to see you at the next lecture in the series scheduled for 4th of November. And I will now take your leave. Have a great remaining day, and thank you again.